week on Quadriga, Mideast turmoil, the struggle for dominance. In Yemen, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels are under attack by a Saudi-led coalition. Observers call this latest conflict a proxy war between Tehran and Riyadh. The two main regional powers are trying to gain the upper hand in the Middle East. Will Yemen be the next state to fall apart? Iran's close ally Syria has already disintegrated. 4 years of civil war have devastated the country. Millions of Syrians have fled, while the Islamic State controls large parts of Syria and neighboring Iraq. One thing is certain, the old regional order no longer applies in the Middle East. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. So is the shape of a new order discernible, or will it take decades to emerge? And what, if anything, can stop the carnage and collapse in the Middle East? That's what we want to talk about today with three people who follow events in the region very closely. It's my pleasure to welcome Amir Musawy. He is the Berlin bureau chief of the Iraqi TV channel Al-Iraquia TV. He's also reported for the Associated Press in London and worked with both the Iraqi Foreign Ministry and several NGOs as a media consultant. And we're very glad to have Adnan Tabatabai on the program for the first time. He's from Iran and analyzes events there for German and English media outlets. He also works as a consultant for the German Foreign Ministry and lectures at the Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf. And finally, Alan Posener is with us again. He was born in London, is now based in Berlin. He's worked as an editor and author for the German newspaper Die Welt and was chief of commentary for Welt am Sonntag. And at present, he contributes to a variety of media, among them the debate magazine, The European. So Syria and Yemen, just two of the Middle Eastern countries that appear to be in free fall and that have become proxies for that age-old rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Adnan Tabatabai, many countries in the region see Iran as the winner of the changes that have occurred since the U.S. intervention in Iraq. Would you agree, and what effect is that having on the strategic aspirations in Tehran?
I believe saying Iran is the winner does imply that Iran has actively been trying to bring things in this direction, whereas I think that it has been rather the failure of some of the U.S. strategies or U.S. operations in the region, which may have ended up in favor of Iran's overall strategic interests. Of course, there is an increasing self-confidence, which at some times leads to reasonable and sometimes less reasonable statements by Iranian officials, but also to anxiety among some of the regional actors. And this is what we are also observing these days with the nuclear negotiations and the anxiety that exists in some of the regional powers and countries.
Amir Musawy, that anxiety prompted Saudi Arabia to intervene last week in Yemen. Isn't it overreacting? Even Saudi Arabia's good friends in Washington say, okay, Iran may be giving some money to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, but that's about it.
Well, when we follow what Saudi Arabia did in the last 5 years, we will find a main line that Saudi Arabia follow. What happened in Bahrain 2 years ago, that the Saudi troops invade Bahrain and support the regime there. It is a kind of overreaction now what's happening in Yemen, because it's really there is no direct threat on the national security in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia support Ali Abdullah Saleh in the past. They support also the Houthis in the past, and they support also the South Yemenites, and now the play is coming in different rules. And I think in the end of the day that Saudi Arabia is now risking with their reputation in the international world, in the international community, or also in the Arab and Muslim community.
Saudi Arabia and other Sunni Arab nations, Alan Posener said that they're going to band together to create a 40,000 man strong military force. How seriously should we take that move? And do you think there's a potential for these proxy wars to turn into a direct hot conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, good luck to them if they manage to put up a 40,000 strong man army. I mean, pan-Arabism has never worked, and I don't think that pan-Sunnism is going to work. So I'm very skeptical about that. But I would disagree with what Amir said. I think there is reason for the Sunnis to be really worried in the region. If you see this arc stretching from Tehran via Baghdad, via Damascus to the Hezbollah, and then in Hamas on Egypt's borders, and so on. You see, and of course now Yemen. You see it from the Sunni standpoint. It must look like a Shia ascension led by Iran. It must look like an offensive, and so and that's why they're reacting this way. Will it lead to a sort of civil war across the region? I don't. Well, it's already happening, isn't it? I mean, it's happening from Lebanon to Tikrit to wherever.
The question, of course, if you look at that arc, which Adnan Tabatabai just told us was simply the Iran making good use of opportunities that arose in the region. But if you look at that arc, it becomes threatening only if you assume that Iran has malevolent intentions. The whole premise of the nuclear negotiations being pushed by the U.S. is that Iran can be brought out of the cold, back into the community of nations, and that its behavior can change. Do you think that's right, Adnan Tabatabai?
I believe that Iran, of course, has to be a very constructive actor in the region, as it is a regional power, whether we like it or not. And with the US withdrawal from Iraq, Iran has no choice but to be constructive in Iraq, as Iraq is its neighboring country. And I think if we, for example, get rid of this prolonged nuclear file and all these discussion around it, it will be easier to actually engage Iran in more meaningful manner and not so much with coercive diplomacy. And say Iran, you have to be more responsible, you have to be more responsive. But this one last point that I would like to make in this regard is that, of course, a constructive actor can be as constructive as it is perceived to be. And of course, we also have to think about how has policy been directed to Iran in the past, and whether Iran has been engaged as a potential partner in the region. I think this has to be, this is yet to happen.
Amir Musawy, would you say that's right, or does that sound like a rather idealistic view to you when you look at Iran?
Well, every European policymaker, when he gets a position or atmosphere what the Iranian have now, he will coming in the conclusion that we should defend our nation, as the Iranian said, and using all the opportunities that's happened in the last 5 years in Iraq, in Syria, and also in Yemen. I think when we look to the position of Iranian from their position, that we will see a country surrounded from United States troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. There is the Gulf states pushing on Iranian economy, and also having a strong allies with the West. And Iranians stand alone in this in the field, and they should do something to their national security. And I think, this is a rational decision of the Iranian. Coming back to your point, I think if we just put the ethnic element of the conflict, Sunni and Shiite, on the side, and looking in the whole conflict as a whole, we will find every state in Arab country, and also Iran and also Turkey, trying to use this new movement in Arab countries to gain more benefit on their side.
Can I just stay with that for one moment? Because this is something quite puzzling about the situation in Yemen. Experts tell us the Houthis really haven't in the past seen themselves primarily as Shia. They've seen themselves as a tribe, that it's a tribal kind of a division in Yemen. So what's going on? Why is this suddenly being redefined into terms Shia, Sunni?
Well, with a more difference between what happened in Iraq with IS when they gained more power suddenly, and what we compared it to this situation with Houthis. Houthis in the end, they are 25% of Yemenis. They are not really Shiite, but they consider themselves a part of the Shiite. They have a good manners and a good sharing points with the Iranian, with the Shiites in Iran and in Iraq. But in the end of the day, they are 25% of the Yemenis. They gain a power because they have agreements and allies with the Saleh, with the, what we call it, the Baathis of Yemen. They got the know-how. They have the military train. They know every corner of the country. 35 years they rule the country, and they gain in one allies. And this is the point, this is the turning point, that the Houthis become a power in Yemen. Even Al-Qaeda is not able to face them in the ground.
I'm glad you mentioned Al-Qaeda, because many people say this fight in Yemen, Alan Posener, is a distraction from the true threat there, which is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's got a strong foothold in Yemen. It's viewed as the most threatening and adept of the various Al-Qaeda affiliates. Would you say this conflict is simply giving Al-Qaeda a better opportunity in Yemen to establish there?
Yes, but what are we saying when we say that? The point about the region, what's happened in the last couple of years, is the total disintegration of state authority. There are no, you can't make peace with anybody because there's no state you can make peace with. You have to make deals with non-state actors, and I think that's why people are so eager to make a deal, at least with Iran, because Iran is a stable state, and the only other stable state in the region, Turkey and Egypt. But the whole Arabian state, all the Arabian states seem to have collapsed almost, Libya to the west and so on. But if you ask, how did that happen? That is very strongly because of Iranian influence. Why has Iraq disintegrated? Because the Shia used their ascendancy, backed by Iran, to form basically a Shia state in Baghdad, a non-inclusive state, which gave IS the possibility of coming. Why is IS so strong in Syria? Because an Iranian-backed regime in Damascus would not negotiate. So I think you have to lay the blame fairly firmly at the door of the people in Tehran.
I would disagree with you on this point, because if we follow the last 30, 40 years what happened in Arab countries, we will see, whether it's Sunnite or Shiite, that there's a regimes do not really represent the community. There is a dictatorship, press over the people, 40 years. In the end of the day, my brother and my sister...
Iraq is a good example, right?
This is a good example. They said, okay, we are not really believe in this call of state. We should looking for another model of state, like in Egyptian. The Islam is this is the answer. This is a movement. What happened in Libya, and also this, I think we cannot blame just Iran. It is just a simple problem. Just we say, I think the state itself had a problem.
No, I think the most important point here is I really do not think there is one single actor to blame for the whole mess or for the chaos, and I think there is a fair share for literally every regional and global power in what happened in Iraq, and then additionally later in Syria. And if you look at Iraq and how the instability after the overthrow of Saddam, for which the Iranians obviously have been praying in order to match your perception of Iran. They've been praying for this. Therefore, of course, that was a positive thing to happen. And what happened after that was basically trying to make sure that the interests of neighboring countries in Iraq are secured, and that led to let's say, alliances that had ugly consequences. But this fight for maintaining their interests under the banner of sectarian alliance has led to horrible realities. So the concept of sectarianism as such was obviously fostered by those who were interested in power, but those ideas have unfortunately caused some realities on the ground as well.
Let me come back to 2 points that Alan Posener raised that also relate again to Yemen. So briefly staying with Yemen. You talked about the fact that most of the Sunni Arab states have collapsed, but of course Saudi Arabia is in there fighting hard. Now, Alan told us a few moments ago that he thinks Saudi Arabia might be overreaching with this attempt to create an army and go into Yemen. And from what we heard from Amir, we know that the Houthis, they're tough, they're battle-tested, they've been in a number of conflicts. Do you think Saudi Arabia might have met a challenge here that it can't master?
I would assume so, because actually the realities on the ground in Yemen, there was a nice comment by a colleague who said Yemen is the Afghanistan of the Arab world. So as to say, this is by definition a quagmire. You will enter into this battlefield which is defined by local conflicts. And there is actually no way this invasion can end in a better context than prior to it. And I think it was an instrument to show for Saudi Arabia we are able to bring together a coalition of 8 or 10 powerful countries in the region, and it's a very short-sighted initiative in my point of view, with no long-term strategies behind it, and that makes the whole thing so dangerous and horrible for the people in Yemen.
Amir Musawy, that makes me wonder why we are seeing the US and Israel supporting this move. I asked Alan Posener about the possibility that this will only make the threat of Al-Qaeda in Yemen worse. In fact, we have just seen a bombing in Yemen for which ISIS claimed attribution. We hadn't seen ISIS in Yemen before. They appear to be establishing a foothold, and some experts tell us it looks like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is working with ISIS. Aren't we seeing a very dire expansion of these two non-state actors on the back of this conflict?
I think the backup that came from the United States and also from Israel, as you said, for Saudi Arabia, for their initiative now in Yemen, it gives more power and more push and backup for the Al-Qaeda and their members inside Yemen to reactive their activity, to gain more power, to gain more people. They are going to argue that, look, this is the unbelievables, this is the Westerns come would like to invade us, and the same story that happened in Iraq. In fact, what the Al-Qaeda and IS said in the end, and I think the conflict is going to be bigger than we say, especially if there's some troops from Saudi Arabia going to cross the border through the Yemen. I think the Houthis are really very well trained of this kind of war against the Saudis, and I think Saudis would make a big mistake if they sent troops in Yemen.
Alan Posener, just 6 months ago, the White House was saying, hey, Yemen is a real model of what we want to do in counterterrorism. We've got a two-pronged effort. We're using remote drone strikes plus training on the ground to make sure that we really go for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Well, just about 10 days ago, the U.S. withdrew its special operations forces from Yemen, essentially undermining that counterterrorism effort.
Well, things happen, right? the United States hasn't been very successful in, I mean, the Obama White House has not been very successful in any of its operations anywhere in the Middle East. Extending its hand to Tehran didn't work. Supporting the Muslim Brotherhood after they came to power in Egypt didn't work. The strike against Libya didn't work. So I'm not really surprised that the Yemen operation didn't work. There is no sense anywhere of an overall strategy from the White House. They seem to, do one thing and then lose interest and go out again. So I'm not at all surprised this hasn't worked.
Many established...
For a second,
oh,
sorry.
Yeah, please do.
At least for your outreach you mentioned to Tehran. I mean, we are seeing 18 months of a diplomatic channel between world powers, permanent member states of the UN Security Council plus Germany and Iran going on with intense talks last night for 8 hours from 9 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. With the result of Iran's nuclear program being at least freezed for the moment with prospects of a long duration for an agreement. I think that at least is a success story for this administration, which started this outreach before President Rouhani was voted or elected. So therefore, I mean, at least this part. With regard to the drone campaigns, I'm totally with you that they have not been.
But isn't containment and a realpolitik approach to balance of power also a strategy? Tom Friedman, who is a well-respected expert on the Middle East, said just this week, he is perfectly happy to see the White House simply standing on the sidelines and trying to stay out of these regional wars.
Yeah, well, I understand the reasoning behind that. It's an old imperial policy to do offshore balancing. It's what the so-called realist lobby in the United States has always wanted. It's what the United States did in Europe before World War II with the results we've seen. I just don't think that the United States can do that because the other powers aren't. I mean, we know that Russia is backing Iran, is backing Damascus. They're saying that it's Russian pilots flying jets against the rebels in Syria because they don't trust Sunnis to fly these jets anymore. So, and they've promised anti-aircraft rockets to Iran. So, I mean, America can't stay out. It's an ideal let them. Plus, it's slightly cynical, right? Let the Sunni and Shia, let the Arabs kill each other. We're going to stay out. It's not going to work. In a globalized world, that doesn't work.
Amir Musawy, let's take another example. It's been posed again and again, the question, could and should the U.S. have done more at a certain point in time to end the Syrian civil war? Do you see a point in these past 5 years where you would have said the U.S. should have acted very, very differently and they could have brought the conflict to an end?
Definitely. In two times. First time, in the beginning of the conflict of Syria, I think the United States should at that time give more attention of this conflict, and they could avoiding a lot of casualties in this, and they could find channels to bring the parties of conflict in the negotiation table. I think this was possible in the beginning. So 4 years later, it was not possible. The conflict has really become bigger and bigger. And now the second chance, I think, when Kerry said that we should talk with Bashar al-Assad, I think Americans are able now, after this 5 years, they have the chance, especially with the negotiation with Iran, with what it could bring solution of this conflict between Iranian and American. I think Americans should do something in Syria conflict because they are the only country able to force the solutions like solution in Kosovo the last decade. What happened in the end? United States brought all the parties in the table and they said, sign.
Adnan Tabatabai, of course, when we look at the beginning of that conflict in Syria, we can realize how rapidly this collapse has been occurring throughout the whole region because it began on the back of the Arab Spring, and there was still a lot of hope, I think, that rebel forces there would gain the upper hand and that it would bring a new era. Do you think that the U.S. truly could have acted at that moment in time to change things on the ground? Given that belief, given that context?
I mean, of course, the actors back then, the administration in Tehran was a different one. So we always have to take that into consideration as well. Obviously, at the very beginning of the conflict in Syria, there are reports that from the highest level in Iran, there was the suggestion for Bashar, or the recommendation to introduce reforms, to not let this escalate. And of course, then on each side there has been mistakes, assuming that the U.S., it is in the end, again, the U.S. who did not solve this crisis. I think that, of course, there is a big share for the regional powers there as well. So I think that a more constructive role and more engagement with those influential powers would have helped to not really let elevate, because this conflict started on a national level, it elevated to a regional level, then to a global level, and before it really escalated, there could have been different steps. In retrospect, it's easy to say that, but obviously, and believing that a rebel group could actually lead to a peaceful transition, I think we should really overcome this idea, because this is not going to happen.
Alan Posener, do you think that if the Realpolitik camp is now in the ascendancy in Washington, we might see some form of compromise with Bashar Assad, at least in the sense of perhaps a transitional government that he might still be a part of? And could that be a solution?
Well, I'm afraid they're in the ascendancy. The neocons have lost all influence, and I don't think it's going to work. This kind of so-called Realpolitik is the most unrealistic thing you can imagine. To go back to Syria, if the United States had hit Bashar al-Assad hard at the beginning and forced him militarily to negotiate, before even the groups were rebels, before Al-Qaeda had risen, before there was even talk of IS, then there might have been a grand, I mean, it would have helped Turkey. It might have helped Iran, I don't know, whether they really wanted Bashar al-Assad to. You see, I think it could have been saved. And what's happening now with this sort of hold back, we'll negotiate with whoever is in power, this will balance that, that is a 19th century policy. It's not going to work. Let them negotiate with
Then
Bashar.
tell us very concretely what you would want to see the U.S., and let's not leave Europe out of this. They're not doing a whole lot better at projecting order and strategy into the region, are they? What would you want to see the Western powers doing in terms of a comprehensive approach?
Well, this in the space of 5 minutes?
Yes.
Well, know who your friends are and support them unreservedly. That I can say in one sentence. Don't, I mean, for instance, in the negotiations with Tehran, don't leave the Saudis and the Israelis out in the cold. Don't give them the impression that you're going to make a deal on their backs. You can make a deal, but don't do it over the heads of the people who are your allies. They may be unsavory allies in the case of Saudi Arabia, and I'm not a friend of them and so on, of theirs and so on, but they are your allies. Don't go above them. For instance, just reinforce your friends and let your enemies know that they are your enemies and that you're going to give them hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree actually to, let's say, 73%.
What more can I want?
I don't like this idea of friends and enemies. I mean, obviously in politics you have interests only, but for the sake of peace, for the sake of the living conditions of people, you will have to create win-win scenarios. Obviously you can't for everyone, but I mean, thinking about know who your enemies are, know who your friends are, is again this reduction to those who is Saudi Arabia really a friend of the United States? So there's a lot to debate, or of the West. So integrate, think about how you can support coalition building in the region. Do not emphasize the cleavages, rather think about how to support the idea of cooperation between those countries.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Well, I would actually think of, when you speak about Syria, then think about what is, in fact, Iran's realistic influence on the Bashar Assad administration, how can we work out something that I think Desmond Tutu was actually proposing for Libya? Think about a meaningful exit strategy. And when you think about the exit strategy, think about those countries who have an intimate knowledge of this context. And Iran obviously has intimate knowledge of Iraq and Syria. So integrate the actors and, as Alan Posener said, speak to everyone, not just in addition to what you said, speak to everyone, not only your friends.
We're told that a different form of integration is already occurring, namely de facto military cooperation. We're told that that's coordinated, for example, via the Iraqi government. Can you confirm that?
I mean, obviously this is happening, but because that's the easiest thing. When you feel threatened by weapons or by a bomb or by a tank, it's easy to then agree, okay, let's do something that we get less harmed. So security and military cooperation and intelligence exchange, that is happening, but this is not happening openly, and this is a parallel universe we won't get insight into. But I think this is going on, and this can be a first step, maybe.
Amir Musawy, I know you're working as a researcher on a project called The Transformation of the Middle East. Let's say that external powers continue their strategy of restraint, of holding back, of doing containment at most, airstrikes, military measures, but no comprehensive approach like the one Alan Posener was calling for. What about the regional powers? What could ever bring Iran and Saudi Arabia to a table to talk about a comprehensive coalition-building strategy for the region?
Okay, if we're talking about this question before Yemen and after Yemen, because this is the very important point, what's happening now in Yemen. I could argue that Iranian could be able to talk with Saudis before Bahrain, before Yemen. I could argue that Saudis could discuss with Iranian about a plan for the region before what's happened in Iraq. But nowadays the conflicts are become so complicated between each part that really it's very strong now, especially when we see it now in the discussion of the nuclear weapon, that Saudis and Israelis backing up, pushing for from other side of the disagreement because they are not interested in. And in the end of the part, this ethnic conflict, the element of ethnic conflict in this Sunnite and Shiite, this bring more fire, more benzene on the fire. I think in the end of the time that we should give the people a chance to decide what they want to do. I mean, in Iraq, in the end of the day, people decide to choose their leaders through election. This what does not happen in Saudi Arabia. This happened in Iran, some part of. We cannot say this is a very good democracy, what happened in Iran, but at least there is a kind of changing in the leadership of the Iranian. But this doesn't happen in Saudi Arabia.
Well, they have just had a change of leadership.
Well,
but
it's in a part of.
Alan Posener, you told us, know who your friends are. Is Egypt our friend? The U.S. has just given some very mixed messages to Egypt, apparently trying carrots and sticks. Will that approach make Egypt a more responsible player? Can we expect anything from them?
Well, I think Egypt's a very responsible player. Mr. al-Sisi, I think he has reason, of course, to distrust the United States because they supported Mr. Morsi, who admittedly was an elected leader and who was deposed by a military coup, and that's not nice. But Mr. Morsi was also not a nice guy. He had dealings with Hamas and so on, and he was on the way to become the kind of elected dictator that we know from Germany, from our history, and so on. We know from Venezuela and other places where. So, I think al-Sisi is on the best way to make Egypt a very important player in the region, a stable player, someone who wants an inclusive government for Egypt. And I think that that's one country, the United States, the most important Arab country. That's one country the United States really needs to grapple to itself with hoops of steel, as they say, not let it drift away. And Turkey is another. It's a stable state, and it's absolutely necessary for Syria. And these are the states we need to really rely on. There are old allies of the West. They're not people who might go one way, might go the other.
You were arguing a moment ago against a realpolitik approach. Many people would say, you've just described one, Turkey and Egypt. There's a lot of instability under the surface there. We're looking at two countries with increasingly strong authoritarian systems.
Well, true, but Turkey, let's face it, is a shining example of democracy compared to every other country in the region except for Israel. So, I mean, come on, let's get real about that. In Iran, in the end, everything is decided by the supreme leader. Now, no matter what they say in parliament, at the end, it's either he gets the stamp of approval from the supreme leader or not. So, we've talked about Riyadh. So, Turkey and Egypt, I say, well, hey, come on.
So we're taping right now in the very last stages of those negotiations about a nuclear agreement with Iran. Let's say the supreme leader were ultimately to agree to a deal. Adnan Tabatabai, looking at the overall situation and the role of the regional powers, what would that do to the geopolitics? Would it be a positive game changer or a rather problematic one?
It would at least be a positive first step, which then, of course, will depend on how Iran as an actor behaves, or how its policies will change or not change, how it is perceived by the regional actors. I think the main point here is that resolving this nuclear negotiations or resolving this nuclear dispute would enable us to start meaningful processes, to engage Iran more meaningfully, and therefore also give Iran the constructive role it has been demanding for so long. So then there is no big political issue in the way to really engage Iran more positively. And I believe this is why we all are hoping that once this deal is agreed, it will be sustainable.
Amir Musawy, devil's advocates say if there is a deal, Saudi Arabia, much like Israel, may only become more intransigent, saying they're going to go for a bomb, whether you believe it or not. So we're going to need a bomb too, Saudi Arabia. Is that a possibility?
Could be for the short time if we have a deal. I think we'll have more challenges in the area in the Middle East, because the parts of the conflict, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they will see, and also Turkey, they will see this as a kind of challenge for them. Iran become a region power, and with a sign of United States, this will gain more instability in the region. But in the long term, I think this will bring more stability in the end of the day for the situation, for the relationship between each country, especially between Iranian and the Gulf states, when they understand there is no threat coming from Iran as nuclear weapons. I think the long term will be very good for the region, but in the end we should facing the challenge in the short term.
Alan Posener, we heard Amir Musawy calling for internal changes in Saudi Arabia, saying that would be the one thing that could make Saudi Arabia a more constructive player. Iran has a huge educated middle class, and we are often told that middle class is quite sympathetic to the West. If Iran is brought in from the cold, if Iran becomes a part of the world trading system again through the lifting of sanctions, mightn't we see real internal change in that country that does make it a more constructive player?
Possibly, but I don't see any precedent for that happening. And you know, this is the European attitude. You know, let's engage these people in trade. Let's talk to them and so on, and somehow this will change everything. Never happened that way, never happened that way. What we really need to do is to tell the Iranian regime, because those are the people we're talking to, is, look, okay, if we do get a deal on nuclear weapons, why do you need missiles capable of hitting Athens and Rome? Why are you developing long-range missiles capable of hitting the United States? If you're only interested in peace and security and blah, 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 why are you doing this? So you really need to keep the pressure on these guys, because let's face it, they are not members of NATO, they're not members of any sort of organization that we are engaged in security-wise. They are working against us. So, okay, so they decide not to build an atomic bomb, which they're not allowed to do anyway, right? Oh, so that's a big deal? No. Now let's talk about your missiles. Let's talk about your support for Hezbollah. Let's talk about your support for Hamas. Let's talk about, you know, your support for revolutionary organizations all over let's talk, you know, for Shia militias in Iraq. I don't think that, you know, I think that you definitely need to keep the screws on these guys.
Adnan Tabatabai, I'll come to you in 1 second, Amir, but Adnan is flying to Tehran tomorrow, so let's get him to address some of those points as a proxy.
Well, I think if you simply cannot look at different Iranian activities in an isolated fashion. I think it is, I wonder which country would negotiate over how it may increase or not increase its military capabilities or capacities. And I think it's obviously when you come to the negotiating table and you agree on something, you have to make sure to continue talking. You have to make sure to come up with verification mechanisms that make sure that all sides, and I repeat, all sides actually see no option in non-compliance, and that holds also true for the things that Iran has to get in reverse, which is first and foremost sanctions relief. So there needs to be a strong UN Security Council resolution ensuring that Iran, which has to then comply to IAEA inspections, Iran abides to everything that is agreed upon, but at the same time a UN resolution has to make sure that the sanctions or the roadmap, let's bring in the word roadmap again, the roadmap to sanctions lifting is followed up in the appropriate fashion. And I think this perception outlined by my highly respected colleague Mr. Posener is a bit, we have to overcome this idea.
Amir, 2 sentences.
2 sentences. We don't have any moral in the politics, but we have a credibility. If you have to gain credibility of the United States, you should pressure on Iranian. The same point, pressure on the Israelis coming back with Palestinians to have an agreement in the end of the day.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us for this very complex subject. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon. Bye-bye.